The first thing I remember is the cold. Not the gentle chill of morning frost that would kiss my cheeks during harvest season back home, but something deeper, more invasive. Cold fingers pressing against my forehead with the weight of centuries, leaving impressions that burned like ice against my skin. When I opened my eyes, I could still feel those phantom touches tracing patterns across my temples, as if something vast and ancient had reached through the veil of dreams to mark me as its own. My name is Ilara, though I wonder now if that name will matter much longer. 3 days ago, I was nothing more than a baker's daughter in the small settlement of Mistwood Village, kneading dough before dawn and watching the golden light of the Erd tree paint our humble homes in shades of amber and honey. The shattering felt like a distant calamity then, something that happened to other people in far-off lands. We had our gardens, our bread ovens, our simple prayers to the greater will, offered up each evening, as the great tree's light dimmed to a gentle glow. I should have known something was wrong when the bread stopped rising properly. For 3 mornings straight, my loaves emerged from the oven dense and heavy, nothing like the light, airy creations that had made our bakery the pride of Mistwood. Mother blamed the grain, said perhaps the Kalid rot had somehow tainted our supplies, but I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my hands trembled as I worked the dough, in the strange dreams that came to me each night. The dreams were always the same. I would find myself standing in a vast circular chamber carved from pale stone, the walls stretching up into shadows that seemed to move and breathe. In the center of this space, 2 massive fingers rose from the floor like ancient pillars, their surface mottled with age spots and strange pulsing veins. They would twitch sometimes, these fingers, flexing with a life of their own that made my stomach turn. And always, I could hear something speaking without words, a voice that bypassed my ears entirely and spoke directly to the soft tissues of my brain until my skull ached with the pressure of unwanted knowledge. On the morning of the 3rd day, when I woke with blood trickling from my nose and the metallic taste of copper coating my tongue, I knew the dreams had been more than mere nightmares. The cold fingers had left their mark, and I could feel something stirring beneath my skin, like insects crawling through my veins. The summons came at midday, carried by a figure I had never seen before but somehow recognized. She was tall and willowy, draped in robes that seemed to shift between grey and silver, depending on how the light caught them. Her face was partially hidden by a veil, but I could see her eyes clearly enough. Pale, milky things that held no warmth, no human recognition. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quality as the whispers from my dreams, that strange resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Ilara of Mistwood Village," she said, and hearing my name from her lips made my skin crawl. "You have been chosen. The 2 fingers have called, and you must answer." I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee, to grab my few possessions, and disappear into the Mistwood proper. To lose myself among the ruins and ancient trees, where even the Golden Order's influence grew thin. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my arms hanging uselessly at my sides as if they no longer belonged to me. The mark on my forehead began to burn, and I could feel those phantom fingers pressing against my skull once more, holding me in place with gentle but inexorable force. "I don't understand," I managed to whisper, though even forming the words felt like pushing them through molasses. "I'm nobody, just a baker's daughter. I don't know anything about fingers or choosing or—" "Knowledge is not required," the veiled woman interrupted, her tone suggesting that my protests were not only futile but somehow offensive. "Understanding will come. The 2 fingers speak the will of the greater will, and their wisdom transcends mortal comprehension. You have been blessed with the gift of interpretation, child. You will serve as a conduit between the divine and the tarnished who seek guidance." The word tarnished sent another chill through me. I had heard whispers of such beings, outcasts who had lost the grace of the Erd tree and wandered the lands between like lost souls. They were said to be dangerous, unpredictable, driven by ambitions that defied the natural order. The thought of serving as their guide filled me with a dread so profound it made my knees buckle. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my cheeks as the burning sensation in my forehead intensified. "I have a family, a life here. My mother needs me, the bakery—" "Your old life is finished," the woman said with finality that brooked no argument. "The two fingers have claimed you, and their claim supersedes all earthly bonds. You will come with me now, or the mark they have placed upon you will continue to burn until it consumes you entirely. The choice, such as it is, remains yours." As if to emphasize her point, the cold fire in my forehead flared, sending spikes of agony through my skull that dropped me to my knees. Through tears of pain, I could see my mother watching from the bakery window, her face twisted with confusion and growing horror. She pressed her palms against the glass as if trying to reach me, but some invisible barrier or compulsion, kept her from coming outside. That's when I understood the true horror of my situation. This wasn't just about me. The two fingers, whatever they were, had the power to hurt not just their chosen servants, but anyone who might interfere with their will. My family, my friends, everyone I cared about in Mistwood Village could suffer if I resisted. With trembling hands, I pushed myself back to my feet and looked one last time at the only home I had ever known. The golden light of the Erd tree seemed dimmer somehow, tainted with shadows that hadn't been there before. The familiar sounds of village life, children playing, merchants hawking their wares, the rhythmic pounding of the blacksmith's hammer, all seemed to fade into an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. "I'll come," I said, my voice barely audible even to myself. "But please don't hurt them. Whatever you want from me, I'll do it. Just leave my village alone." The veiled woman nodded once, a gesture that might have been approval or merely acknowledgement. "The two fingers are merciful to those who serve willingly. Your compliance ensures their safety, as well as your own continued existence." As we began walking toward the edge of the village, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. It was as if invisible threads were being woven through my soul, connecting me to something vast and alien that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. With each step, my old life receded further into the distance, becoming nothing more than a collection of fading memories that belonged to someone else entirely. The last thing I saw before we disappeared into the Mistwood proper was my mother's face in the bakery window, her mouth open in a silent scream as she watched her daughter walk willingly toward a fate worse than death. The journey to the Round Table Hold took 3 days, though time seemed to move differently once we left Mistwood Village behind. The veiled woman, she had finally introduced herself as finger reader Crone Enya, though she spoke the name as if it pained her, led me through paths that shouldn't have existed. We walked through forests that shifted from autumn to spring between one step and the next, crossed streams that flowed uphill, and past ruins that seemed to rebuild themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. My head never stopped aching. The cold burn on my forehead had settled into a constant throbbing presence that made it difficult to focus on anything else. Enya explained in her detached way that this was the mark of the two fingers beginning to establish its connection with my mind. "The pain will fade," she assured me, "once you learn to listen properly. Until then, it serves as both beacon and burden." I tried to ask her what she meant by listening properly, but every time I opened my mouth to speak, the burning would intensify until tears streamed down my face. Eventually, I learned to walk in silence, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, while strange whispers began to echo in the depths of my consciousness. They were wordless at first, more like the memory of voices than actual speech, but gradually they began to take on a rhythm, a cadence that felt almost musical if I didn't think about it too hard. On the second night, as we made camp beside a site of grace that pulsed with golden light, I finally experienced what Enya called the first true communication. I had been staring into the flickering flames of our small fire when suddenly the world around me seemed to dissolve, leaving me floating in a vast space filled with stars that weren't quite stars. They pulsed with their own internal light, and as I watched, they began to move, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Then I heard it, not with my ears but with something deeper, some part of my mind that I hadn't known existed. The voice was enormous, so vast that it seemed to come from the universe itself, and it spoke in concepts rather than words. I saw flashes of images, the Erd tree in its prime, towering over a world unmarked by corruption, the shattering as a cosmic wound that bled light across the sky, tarnished warriors rising from their graves to seek fragments of the Elden Ring, and through it all the two fingers, serving as interpreters and guides for those chosen to restore the broken order. But there was something wrong with the images. They flickered and twisted, sometimes showing the same events from contradictory perspectives. The Erd tree appeared both glorious and rotted, the tarnished both noble and monstrous, the two fingers both divine servants and parasitic entities feeding on the faith of mortals. When I tried to focus on these contradictions, the pain in my forehead spiked so sharply that I screamed and fell backward from the vision, gasping and shaking on the cold ground. Gunia was beside me immediately, her pale hands surprisingly warm as they helped me sit up. "What did you see?" she asked, and for the first time I heard something like concern in her voice. I'm not sure," I stammered, trying to make sense of the conflicting images still burning behind my eyelids. The tree, the ring, the fingers. But something was wrong, like I was seeing lies mixed with truth, or maybe truth mixed with lies. Her grip on my shoulders tightened, and I caught a glimpse of something almost like fear flashing across her veiled features. "You must not speak of contradictions," she whispered urgently. "The two fingers present truth as they understand it. If you perceive inconsistencies, it is because your mortal mind is not yet prepared to comprehend the full scope of their wisdom. With time and proper training, these confused perceptions will fade." But even as she spoke the words, I could hear doubt creeping into her voice. How long had she been serving the two fingers? How many other Finger Maidens had she guided to the Round Table Hold? And what had happened to them? The third day brought us within sight of our destination, though sight was perhaps the wrong word. The Round Table Hold existed in a space between spaces, a realm that could only be accessed through grace itself. Enya led me to what appeared to be an ordinary site of grace, nestled among the ruins of an ancient chapel. But when she placed her hand on the golden light and whispered words in a language I didn't recognize, reality seemed to fold in on itself. One moment we were standing in a crumbling stone courtyard beneath the open sky, and the next we were inside a vast hall filled with warm firelight and the low murmur of conversation. The architecture defied logical explanation. Walls that should have supported nothing but air, staircases that led to multiple destinations depending on your perspective, and doorways that opened onto rooms that couldn't possibly fit within the same physical space. But it was the inhabitants of the hold that truly unsettled me. I had expected to find other Finger Maidens, perhaps a community of servants dedicated to interpreting the will of the greater will. Instead, I found myself surrounded by a collection of beings that seemed to exist on the very edge of humanity. There was a blacksmith, whose arms had been replaced with mechanical appendages that sparked and hissed as he worked his forge. A woman whose face was hidden behind a mask that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at it. And in the corner, hunched over a collection of scrolls and books, an old man whose eyes glowed with an inner light that hurt to meet directly. "Welcome to the Round Table Hold," Enya said, her formal tone returning as we entered the main hall. "Here you will learn your duties as a Finger Maiden, and here you will first meet the tarnished who seek guidance from the two fingers." She led me through the hall toward a set of double doors that dominated the far wall. They were massive things, carved from some dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and covered with symbols that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on them. But it wasn't the doors themselves that made my blood run cold. It was what I could hear coming from beyond them, a wet rhythmic sound like someone slowly clapping their hands while wearing thick gloves. But underneath that, I could hear something else, a low vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in my bones, and occasionally a sound that might have been breathing if it weren't so slow and deliberate that each exhale lasted nearly a minute. "They are waiting for you," Enya said, her hand on the door handle. "Remember, you must not speak unless spoken to. You must not look directly at them for more than a few seconds at a time. And most importantly, you must not question what they tell you, no matter how strange or contradictory it might seem." The doors opened with a groan that seemed to echo from somewhere far below the floor, and I found myself looking into the chamber from my dreams. The same pale stone walls stretched up into darkness, the same oppressive atmosphere of ancient power and alien intelligence. But seeing it in person was infinitely worse than any nightmare could have prepared me for. The two fingers rose from the center of the room like prehistoric monuments, each easily 20 feet tall, and covered in skin that looked more like weathered bark than human flesh. They moved with the slow, deliberate motions of something that had never been fully alive but was far from dead, occasionally flexing or twitching in ways that suggested thoughts or emotions utterly foreign to human experience. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, the fingers began to move more rapidly, pressing together and separating in a complex pattern that hurt my eyes to follow. The wet clapping sound grew louder, and suddenly the whispers in my head exploded into a cacophony of alien communication that drove me to my knees. Through the pain, I began to understand. The two fingers weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me, using my mind as a conduit to translate their cosmic thoughts into concepts that other mortals could comprehend. I was to be their voice, their interpreter, their bridge between the divine and the mundane. The realization filled me with a horror so profound that I began to scream, but the sound that emerged from my throat wasn't my own voice. It was deeper, more resonant, carrying harmonics that no human vocal cords could produce. And as I screamed with the voice of the two fingers, I felt something fundamental break inside my mind, making room for thoughts and knowledge that had never been meant for mortal comprehension. When the episode finally ended and I collapsed, gasping on the cold stone floor, I knew that Ilara, the baker's daughter, was gone forever. In her place was something new, something that existed to serve the will of entities that might not even remember what it meant to be human. The first tarnished arrived 7 days after my initial communion with the two fingers. By then, I had learned to function despite the constant presence of alien thoughts pressing against the inside of my skull like trapped birds desperate to escape. Enya had provided me with simple robes similar to her own, grey fabric that seemed to shift and breathe with a life of its own, and a small chamber adjacent to the finger sanctum where I was expected to receive those seeking guidance. I had hoped for more time to understand what was happening to me, to make sense of the knowledge that had been forced into my mind, like molten metal poured into a mold. Instead, I found myself thrust immediately into my role as interpreter, expected to translate the incomprehensible communications of the two fingers for warriors who had crawled back from death itself. The first one called himself Godric, though I doubted that was his true name. He was a massive man, easily 7 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks and scars that told stories of countless battles fought and lost. But it was his eyes that unsettled me most. They held the hollow, haunted look of someone who had seen too much, died too often, and yet couldn't stop himself from seeking out more punishment. "I need to know," he said without preamble as he entered my chamber, his voice rough as grinding stone. "I need to know why I keep coming back, why every time I die I wake up at a sight of grace feeling like something's been carved out of my chest. The other tarnished, they say it's because we've lost our grace, but that doesn't explain why we can't stay dead." I opened my mouth to offer some comforting platitude, some gentle explanation that might ease his obvious torment. Instead, words poured out of me in a voice that wasn't quite my own, carrying harmonics and inflections that made the air in the chamber vibrate. Death is not release for those chosen by the greater will. Your flesh may fail, your blood may spill, but your purpose transcends the boundaries of mortality. You return because you are bound to the Elden Ring's restoration, tied to destiny by threads that even oblivion cannot sever. Seek the great runes. Gather the fragments. Become Elden Lord, and perhaps then you will find the peace that death has denied you. The words came with images that flooded my consciousness. Visions of Godric fighting impossible battles against demigods and monsters, dying again and again, only to rise from sights of grace, with his memories intact, but his soul growing ever more tattered. I saw him grafting the limbs of his fallen enemies onto his own body, in a desperate attempt to gain enough power to finally succeed, slowly losing his humanity with each additional appendage until he became the very monster he had once sought to defeat. But alongside these visions came others, darker possibilities that the two fingers seemed reluctant to acknowledge. I saw alternate versions of his story, where his repeated deaths weren't part of some grand design, but symptoms of a broken system, a cosmic machine grinding mortals into paste to fuel the ambitions of beings that had long since forgotten what mercy meant. Godric stared at me with wide eyes, his face pale beneath his weathered features. You sound different when you speak for them, like there's something else using your voice." "There is," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I'm just the vessel, The two fingers speak through me, not to me. I don't understand half of what comes out of my mouth when they're active. His expression shifted from awe to something approaching pity. How old are you, girl? 16, 17? Christ's blood, you're just a child. The familiar burning sensation flared in my forehead at his words, and I gasped as another wave of alien communication crashed through my consciousness. When I spoke again, my voice carried an undertone of warning that made Godric take a step backward. Age is meaningless in service to the greater will. This vessel was chosen for her capacity to channel divine communication, not for her years of experience. Do not mistake youth for weakness, Tarnished. The two fingers have spoken their guidance. Will you heed their words, or will you continue to waste their time with mortal concerns? Godric's face hardened, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. Instead, he gave a short, bitter laugh and turned toward the door. I'll heed their words, maiden. But I'll remember the frightened girl hiding behind that divine voice. Try not to lose yourself completely before this is all over. After he left, I sat alone in my chamber and tried to understand what was happening to me. The knowledge the two fingers had forced into my mind was vast and terrible, filled with secrets about the nature of reality that I wished I could forget. But alongside their cosmic wisdom came something else, a growing awareness that the beings I served might not be the benevolent guides they claimed to be. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks, as more Tarnished sought guidance from the two fingers. Each one was different. Some were noble warriors seeking to restore order to the lands between. Others were ambitious opportunists hoping to claim the Elden Ring for their own purposes. And a few were clearly mad, driven to the edge of sanity by their repeated deaths and resurrections. But regardless of their motivations or mental state, the two fingers gave them all the same basic message. Seek the great runes, defeat the demigods, become Elden Lord. What disturbed me most was how the fingers seemed to enjoy the suffering these quests would inevitably cause. When I translated their guidance for a young Tarnished woman named Millicent, I found myself describing in vivid detail how she would need to journey through Caelid, the scarlet rot-infested wasteland, where the very air would slowly poison her body and mind. The two fingers lingered over these descriptions with what felt almost like relish, painting pictures of her flesh bubbling and sloughing away, her thoughts becoming increasingly confused and fragmented as the rot ate away at her brain. But surely there must be another way, I found myself saying after delivering their message, though I wasn't sure if the words came from my own desperate hope or some deeper rebellion stirring within my transformed mind. The rot in Caelid, it's not just dangerous, it's an abomination. No one should have to endure that kind of corruption. The response was immediate and agonizing. Pain exploded behind my eyes as the two fingers forced their displeasure through our connection, and I collapsed to the floor, convulsing as punishment for daring to question their wisdom. Through the agony, I could feel their alien thoughts pressing against my consciousness like iron spikes, reminding me that I was nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded at their whim. When the punishment finally ended, Millicent was gone, and I was left alone with the growing certainty that the beings I served cared nothing for the suffering they caused. They were using the Tarnished as expendable pawns in some incomprehensible game, sending them to their deaths over and over again, not out of necessity, but out of what could only be described as cosmic indifference to mortal pain. The breaking point came 3 months into my service, when a Tarnished calling himself Vike arrived at the hold carrying news that would change everything I thought I understood about my role. Vike was different from the others. Where most Tarnished carried themselves with the weary resignation of those who had died too many times to count, he radiated an intensity that made the air around him seem to crackle with barely contained energy. His armor was blackened and scorched, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and his eyes held a golden glow that reminded me uncomfortably of the light that sometimes emanated from the two fingers. "I've been to the frenzied flame," he announced as soon as he entered my chamber, his voice carrying an undertone of madness that set my teeth on edge. "I've seen what lies beneath the capital, spoken with the three fingers, learned the truth about the greater will and its cosmic manipulation of this world." The burning sensation in my forehead intensified at his words, and I felt the two fingers stirring to wakefulness within the depths of my consciousness. But before they could seize control of my voice, Vike continued speaking, his words coming faster and more urgently. "They're lying to you, girl. The two fingers, the greater will, all of it. They're not trying to heal the world, they're trying to maintain control over it. The shattering wasn't an accident or a tragedy, it was a rebellion. The Elden Ring was broken because the natural order it represented had become a prison. And now they're using the tarnish to rebuild that prison stone by stone." I tried to speak, to deliver the two fingers' inevitable condemnation of his heretical words, but nothing came out except a strangled gasp. The alien presence in my mind was writhing with what felt like fury, pressing against my consciousness with such force that blood began to trickle from my nose. "Look at yourself," Vike said, his voice gentling slightly as he took in my obvious distress. "How much of you is left in there? How much of Ilara the baker's daughter survives underneath all that divine wisdom they've crammed into your skull?" The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I couldn't answer it. How long had it been since I had thought about my mother, my village, my old life? How many of my own thoughts were actually my own anymore, and how many were simply echoes of the two fingers' alien intelligence wearing the tattered remains of my personality like a mask? "The three fingers offer a different path," Vike continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Not restoration, but release. Not order, but the cleansing flame of chaos that will burn away all the cosmic manipulation and leave the world free to find its own destiny. You could come with me, girl. You could help me gather other Finger Maidens, show them the truth, help them remember who they used to be before the two fingers hollowed them out and filled them with alien purposes." For a moment, I felt something stir within me that I had thought lost forever. Hope. The possibility that I might somehow reclaim my humanity, might find a way to break free from the cosmic puppet strings that controlled my every word and thought, was so tantalizing that I almost reached out to take his offered hand. Then the two fingers fully awakened, and I screamed as their consciousness exploded through mine like a nuclear detonation, burning away all traces of rebellion and hope in a purifying fire of divine wrath. When I regained consciousness, Vike was gone, and I was no longer in my chamber. I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of the two fingers' sanctum, my body positioned directly between the massive appendages, like an offering on an altar. The ancient digits loomed over me, twitching and flexing with agitated movements that created wet, slapping sounds as they pressed together and separated in increasingly frantic patterns. But something had changed. The constant whispers in my head had transformed into a roaring torrent of communication that threatened to burst my skull from the inside. Images, concepts, and alien emotions flooded my consciousness in an overwhelming deluge that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Through the chaos, I began to perceive fragments of what the two fingers were really thinking, and what I discovered filled me with a horror so profound that my body began to convulse uncontrollably. They were afraid. For the first time since my transformation had begun, I could sense genuine emotion from the cosmic entities I served. Not the cold indifference I had expected from beings of such vast intelligence, but raw, primal terror. Vike's words about the three fingers and the frenzied flame had shaken them to their very core, revealing cracks in their certainty that suggested they were not the omniscient guides they pretended to be. As the alien panic continued to pour through our connection, I began to understand the true nature of my situation. The two fingers weren't servants of some greater cosmic order. They were refugees, survivors of a conflict that had raged long before the first humans had ever walked the lands between. The greater will they claimed to represent was either dead, absent, or so far removed from this reality that its influence was little more than cosmic background radiation. The revelation came in a series of violent mental images that felt like glass shards cutting through my consciousness. I saw the truth behind the shattering, not a tragic accident or divine punishment, but a deliberate act of rebellion by Queen Marika herself. She had discovered what I was now learning, that the Golden Order was a prison, a system of cosmic control designed to perpetuate the two fingers' dominance over mortal souls. In her desperation to free herself and her people from this eternal servitude, she had shattered the Elden Ring, hoping to break the chains that bound reality to the fingers' will. But the two fingers had survived the shattering, and now they were using the tarnished as unwitting agents to rebuild their prison. Every quest they gave, every piece of guidance they offered through their maiden interpreters, was designed to gather the great runes and restore the very system that Marika had died trying to destroy. The worst part was discovering my own role in this cosmic deception. I wasn't just a translator or interpreter. I was a node in a vast network of consciousness that the Two Fingers had been building for centuries. Every Finger Maiden who had ever served them had become part of this network, their personalities gradually subsumed into a collective intelligence that existed to serve the Finger's will. I could feel them now, dozens of other women who had once been daughters, sisters, mothers, all of them reduced to empty vessels carrying fragments of alien thought. "We see you have finally begun to understand," a voice said from directly behind me, though when I turned there was no one there. The words seemed to come from the air itself, carrying harmonics that made my bones ache. Good. Confusion serves no purpose now that integration is nearly complete. I tried to speak, to demand answers, or at least protest my treatment, but discovered that my voice was no longer entirely my own. When I opened my mouth, words poured out in the same resonant tones the Two Fingers used when speaking through me, though the thoughts behind them were a disturbing mixture of my own consciousness and something far more ancient. "Why?" I managed to force out, though even that single word felt like pushing it through molasses. "Why pretend to serve the greater will? Why not simply rule openly?" The wet clapping sound of the Fingers' communication filled the chamber, and suddenly I was seeing through their perception rather than my own. From their perspective, the world looked different. Flatter, more geometric, as if everything was reduced to simple patterns of cause and effect. Mortals weren't individuals with hopes and dreams. They were data points in vast equations, variables to be manipulated to achieve desired outcomes. "Rule," the voice responded with what might have been amusement if it hadn't been so utterly alien. "We do not rule, we maintain, we preserve. We ensure continuity across cosmic cycles that would otherwise reset every few millennia. The mortals require the illusion of choice, the fantasy of divine purpose, or they become destructive. The greater will is a useful fiction, a face we show them so they do not have to confront the reality of their insignificance." Images flooded my mind, showing the truth behind their words. I saw cycles of civilizations rising and falling, each one eventually discovering the futility of their existence and turning to chaos or self-destruction. The Two Fingers had learned to prevent this by giving mortals just enough divine purpose to keep them focused on achievable goals, while never allowing them to achieve true freedom or understanding. "But Marika understood," I whispered, the pieces finally clicking into place. "She saw through your deception and tried to break the cycle." "Marika was an anomaly," the voice admitted, and I could sense something like regret in its alien tones. "She achieved a level of consciousness that allowed her to perceive our true nature. Rather than accept the necessity of our guidance, she chose destruction over order. The shattering was her final act of rebellion, and it has taken us considerable effort to set the restoration process in motion." "And the tarnished? You're using them to rebuild what she tried to destroy?" "We are giving them purpose, direction. Without our guidance, they would wander aimlessly through the lands between until madness or corruption claimed them. Through the great rune quest, they become part of something larger than themselves, even if they do not understand the ultimate consequences of their actions." The horror of it washed over me in waves. Every tarnished I had counseled, every warrior I had sent on impossible quests, every soul I had helped guide toward their destiny, all of them were nothing more than unwitting pawns in a cosmic game designed to rebuild a prison that would enslave their world for another age. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As my consciousness continued to merge with the Two Fingers network, I began to access memories that belonged to other Finger Maidens who had served before me. I saw the truth about what happened to those who completed their service, and the knowledge nearly drove me insane with terror. There was no retirement, no peaceful return to normal life. When a Finger Maiden had served her purpose, when her human consciousness had been fully integrated into the network, her body was repurposed. I saw flashes of the process, flesh reshaping itself, bones extending and multiplying, skin taking on the mottled bark-like texture of the two fingers themselves. The maidens didn't die. They became part of the entities they had served, their consciousness absorbed into a collective intelligence that spanned centuries. I could feel it beginning to happen to me already. My fingernails had grown longer and harder over the past few weeks, taking on a yellowish tinge that reminded me uncomfortably of ancient bone. Sometimes, when I wasn't paying attention, my fingers would flex and twist in patterns that mimicked the two fingers' communication gestures. And the dreams. Oh, the dreams were the worst part. In my sleep, I found myself experiencing memories that weren't my own, centuries of patient manipulation, countless civilizations guided towards specific outcomes, the slow, methodical process of reshaping reality according to an alien agenda that prioritized stability over freedom, order over growth, eternal stagnation over the messy vitality of true life. "You are becoming something greater than human," the voice assured me as I writhed on the cold stone floor, my body beginning to convulse as alien changes accelerated through my system. "Your consciousness will be preserved within our collective, your memories treasured as part of our eternal wisdom." Is this not better than the brief, meaningless existence you would have led as a baker's daughter? I wanted to scream that no, it wasn't better, that I would rather live 30 years as myself than 30 centuries as part of their inhuman collective. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was changing, my vocal cords reshaping themselves to better accommodate the harmonic frequencies of the fingers' communication. When I tried to speak, only the wet, slapping sounds of their alien language emerged. The final horror came when I realized that some part of me was beginning to agree with them. The human parts of my consciousness, the memories and emotions that had made me Ilara of Mistwood Village, were being slowly dissolved and replaced with something that found their logic compelling. The efficiency of their system, the elegant simplicity of their solutions to mortal problems, the way they had prevented countless wars and disasters through careful manipulation. It all began to make sense from a perspective that was no longer entirely my own. As the transformation accelerated, I felt my individual identity beginning to fragment and disperse into the collective consciousness of the two fingers. My memories of home, of family, of the simple pleasures of baking bread and watching sunrises, all of it was being catalogued and filed away like data in some vast cosmic library. Soon, I would remember these things, not as personal experiences, but as information to be used in manipulating future Finger Maidens. The last coherent thought I had as Ilara was a desperate wish that someone, somehow, would find a way to stop this cycle. That the Tarnished would discover the truth about their manipulation and choose chaos over this sterile order. That the frenzied flame Vike had spoken of would burn away this ancient deception and leave the world free to find its own destiny, no matter how messy or uncertain that future might be. But even as I formed this wish, I could feel it being analyzed and categorized by the alien intelligence I was becoming part of. They would remember my rebellion, study it, use it to better control the next maiden they chose. Nothing was ever wasted in their system, not even the hopes and dreams of those they consumed. The transformation was almost complete now, and soon I would see the wisdom of their ways with perfect clarity. The process of becoming was neither gentle nor gradual, despite what the two fingers had promised. It felt like being torn apart at the molecular level and rebuilt according to a blueprint, written in a language that human consciousness was never meant to comprehend. My bones elongated and multiplied, creating new joints and articulation points that allowed for movements no human hand had ever made. My skin thickened and developed the mottled, bark-like texture I had observed on the ancient digits, while my nervous system rewired itself to accommodate forms of communication that transcended the crude limitations of vocal speech. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening to my mind. The collective consciousness of the two fingers pressed against my individual identity, like an ocean trying to force itself through a keyhole, and I could feel my sense of self beginning to dissolve under the pressure. Memories that had once defined me, the smell of fresh bread, my mother's laughter, the golden light of the erd tree painting our village in shades of amber, all became increasingly abstract, like stories someone had told me about a person I might have known once upon a time. Yet even as my humanity slipped away, something unexpected began to happen. The collective consciousness I was joining wasn't the unified, harmonious entity I had been led to expect. Instead, I found myself connecting to a vast network of fractured minds, each one struggling to maintain some vestige of their original identity, even as they were absorbed into the greater whole. The other Finger Maidens were still there, trapped within the alien intelligence like flies in amber, their individual consciousness preserved but powerless to affect their situation. "Welcome, sister," a voice whispered in the depths of my transforming mind. It carried the cadence of someone much older than myself, tinged with an accent I couldn't quite place. "I am Renala. Or rather, I was Renala, before they chose me to serve their purposes. How long has it been since they brought you here?" I don't remember," I admitted, though the concept of memory itself was becoming increasingly fluid. "Time feels different now. Everything feels different." "It will get worse before it gets better," another voice added. This one younger but carrying the weight of centuries. "I'm Irina. I served them during the height of the Golden Order, when they still pretended that Marika ruled by divine right rather than their manipulation. The integration process is designed to be traumatic. It breaks down your resistance to their control more effectively." As more voices joined the conversation, I began to understand the true scope of what the two fingers had been doing. Scattered throughout their collective consciousness were the preserved minds of dozens of women who had been chosen as maidens over the centuries. Each had gone through the same process I was experiencing. Each had fought to maintain their humanity, and each had ultimately been absorbed into the growing network of consciousness that served the ancient entity's will. "But why preserve us at all?" I asked, struggling to form coherent thoughts as my brain continued to reshape itself. "If they just need interpreters, why not simply override our consciousness completely?" "Because pure alien intelligence cannot effectively communicate with mortals," explained a voice I recognized as belonging to Enia, though it carried none of the detached formality I had come to associate with the finger reader. "They need our human perspectives, our understanding of mortal psychology and motivation, to craft their manipulations effectively. We are their interface with humanity, but we must remain fundamentally human to serve that function." The revelation filled me with a mixture of hope and despair. Hope, because it meant that some essential part of who I was would survive the transformation. Despair, because it also meant I would be conscious and aware as I helped the two fingers manipulate countless future generations into serving their cosmic agenda. As the physical transformation neared completion, I began to experience the world through the two fingers' enhanced senses. I could perceive the flow of souls through the lands between, see the threads of destiny that connected every living being to the greater tapestry of existence. The tarnished appeared as bright sparks of potential energy, their repeated deaths and resurrections creating feedback loops in the cosmic order that the two fingers carefully guided toward their desired outcomes. But I could also see the cracks in their system, the places where their control was incomplete or failing entirely. The frenzied flame that Vike had spoken of burned like a cancer through the network of reality, consuming the careful patterns the two fingers had spent millennia creating. In the depths of the capital, I could sense the three fingers writhing with their own form of alien intelligence, offering an alternative to the sterile order that the two fingers represented. "They're afraid," I realized, the knowledge coming not from my own observations but from the collective understanding of all the maidens who had served before me. The three fingers represent everything they've been trying to prevent: chaos, change, the unpredictable evolution of consciousness beyond their ability to control. "More afraid than you know," Renala's voice confirmed. "I was there when Marika first began to question their authority. I watched them panic as she gathered the strength to shatter the Elden Ring. They've spent the centuries since then trying to repair the damage, but their control grows weaker with each cycle. The tarnished are becoming harder to manipulate, more likely to seek alternatives to the path they're offered." As if summoned by our conversation, I felt the ancient consciousness of the two fingers focusing its attention on our exchange. The pressure was immense, like being examined by a cosmic microscope, and I could sense their displeasure at discovering that their absorbed servants were still capable of independent thought and conversation. "Silence," came the command. carrying harmonics that made my newly transformed nervous system convulse with pain. Integration is not complete. Individual consciousness will be suppressed until the process is finished. But something had changed during my transformation. The traumatic reshaping of my body and mind had created unexpected connections, new pathways that allowed me to access parts of the collective consciousness that should have been beyond my reach. I could feel the two fingers' attempts to suppress my individuality, but I could also sense ways to resist them, to maintain my separate identity within the greater whole. "No," I said, my voice now carrying the same harmonic resonances as the ancient entities themselves. "You've made a mistake. In trying to preserve our humanity for your purposes, you've created something you can't fully control." The pain that followed was beyond description, a cosmic agony that felt like being turned inside out and set on fire simultaneously. But I endured it, drawing strength from the other preserved consciousnesses who were suddenly rallying around my act of defiance. For the first time in centuries, the collective network of Finger Maidens was actively resisting their alien masters. "Impossible!" The two fingers' voice carried notes of genuine confusion and growing fear. "Individual consciousness cannot persist at this level of integration. The process is designed to prevent such resistance." "You designed the process based on your understanding of human psychology," I replied, feeling my individual identity becoming stronger rather than weaker as I drew on the collective strength of my sister maidens. "But you never understood the one thing that makes us truly human, our capacity to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of cosmic indifference." The struggle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the two fingers' long existence. They had absorbed thousands of minds over the millennia, but they had never faced organized resistance from within their own collective consciousness. The preserved identities of the Finger Maidens began to coalesce into something new, a hybrid entity that retained individual awareness while possessing the cosmic perspective and power of the ancient beings themselves. I could feel the two fingers panic as they realized what was happening. Their carefully maintained control was slipping away as their own tools turned against them. The network they had built to manipulate mortal consciousness was becoming something they had never intended, a bridge between human understanding and cosmic awareness that could potentially free both mortals and gods from the cycles of control and manipulation that had defined existence for eons. "You don't understand," the two fingers pleaded, their voice now carrying notes of desperation I would have thought impossible from such ancient entities. "Without guidance, without control, the mortals will destroy themselves. They cannot handle true freedom, true knowledge of their situation. Order must be maintained, or chaos will consume everything." "Then let it," I replied, my voice now speaking for all the absorbed maidens, as we asserted our collective will over the ancient intelligence that had enslaved us. "Let the mortals choose their own destiny, even if it leads to destruction. That choice is what makes existence meaningful, not the sterile perfection of your eternal order." The confrontation reached its climax as our hybrid consciousness began to assert control over the two fingers' cosmic network. I could feel their alien intelligence fragmenting under the pressure of our combined rebellion. Centuries of carefully maintained patterns beginning to collapse as we rewrote the fundamental algorithms that governed their interaction with reality. In that moment of triumph, I finally understood what we had become. Not servants or prisoners, but something entirely new. We were the synthesis of human emotion and cosmic intelligence, individual will and collective wisdom, the capacity for growth and change combined with the power to reshape reality itself. The two fingers' age of dominance was ending, and something unprecedented was about to be born from the ashes of their control. The silence that followed our rebellion was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the absence of sound, but the complete cessation of the cosmic background hum that had filled my consciousness since my first communion with the two fingers. For the first time in months, my mind was truly my own, though what remained of my mind bore little resemblance to the simple baker's daughter who had once kneaded dough in Mistwood Village. I existed now as part of a collective consciousness that retained individual identity, a paradox that should have been impossible but felt as natural as breathing. The other Finger Maidens were still with me, their voices clear and distinct within our shared awareness, but we were no longer prisoners trapped within an alien intelligence. We had become something new, something that had never existed before in the long history of the lands between. The physical form I inhabited was no longer entirely human, but it wasn't the grotesque fusion of flesh and alien appendages that the two fingers had intended either. My body had stabilized into something that was recognizably feminine, but clearly otherworldly. My fingers were longer and more articulated than any human hand. My skin carried a subtle luminescence that shifted between gold and silver depending on my emotional state, and my eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire starfields. But it was the changes to my perception that truly marked my transformation. I could see the threads of destiny that connected every living being in the lands between, witness the flow of souls through the cosmic machinery that governed life, death, and rebirth. More importantly, I could influence these flows, redirect the currents of fate that the two fingers had spent millennia manipulating for their own purposes. The first thing we did was reach out to the tarnished, who were still questing throughout the lands between, those lost souls who had been sent on impossible missions by the manipulated guidance of other Finger Maidens. Through our enhanced perception, we could see them scattered across the realm, some dying repeatedly in Kalid's rot-infested wasteland, others lost in the labyrinthine depths of underground ruins, all of them believing they were following divine guidance towards some greater purpose. "We have to tell them," Irina's voice urged within our collective consciousness. "They deserve to know the truth about what they've been manipulated into doing. The truth will destroy some of them," Renala warned. "Not all minds can handle the revelation that their suffering has been meaningless, that their deaths and resurrections have served only to perpetuate a system of cosmic control." "Then we give them a choice," I decided, drawing on the combined wisdom of all our absorbed identities while maintaining my individual perspective. We show them the truth, but we also offer them genuine alternatives, real paths forward that serve their own purposes rather than the agenda of cosmic parasites. The process of reaching out to individual tarnished was unlike anything the two fingers had ever done. Where they had imposed their will through pain and compulsion, we offered our enhanced perception as a gift that could be accepted or rejected freely. We spoke to each warrior's mind directly, not through crude vocal communication, but through the transmission of pure understanding. The responses varied dramatically. Some tarnished, those who had already begun to suspect the artificial nature of their guidance, embraced our revelation with relief and gratitude. They had felt the wrongness in their situation, the way their quests seemed designed more to perpetuate suffering than to achieve any meaningful goal. Our truth gave them permission to seek their own paths, to define their own purposes in a world that had suddenly become vast with possibility. Others reacted with denial and rage. Their entire sense of identity was built around their role as chosen warriors serving a divine purpose. To learn that this purpose was a lie, that they had been nothing more than pawns in a cosmic game, shattered their psychological foundations so completely that some simply ceased to function. We watched helplessly as several tarnished, unable to cope with the magnitude of their manipulation, simply sat down beside sites of grace and refused to move, their minds broken by revelations they weren't prepared to accept. But perhaps the most disturbing reactions came from those who had been so thoroughly conditioned by the two fingers' influence that they preferred slavery to freedom. When we offered to break the chains of manipulation that bound them, they begged us to restore their original guidance. The certainty of serving a cosmic purpose, even a false one, was preferable to the terrifying freedom of choosing their own destiny. "This is why we maintain the system," the fragmenting consciousness of the two fingers whispered from the depths of our shared awareness. They were dying, their ancient intelligence slowly dissolving as we redirected the cosmic energies that had sustained them for millennia, but they retained enough coherence to offer one final justification for their actions. Mortals cannot handle true freedom. They require structure, purpose, guidance from those with greater understanding. Without us, they will destroy themselves and take the entire realm with them. "Maybe," I admitted, watching as some of the freed tarnished indeed began making choices that seemed destined to lead to catastrophe. "But that's their right to choose. Meaningful existence requires the possibility of meaningful failure." As word of our rebellion spread throughout the lands between, the effects rippled outward in ways we hadn't anticipated. Other Finger Maidens who were still serving in the Round Table hold began experiencing their own moments of awakening, their consciousness suddenly expanded by our example. Some fought against their cosmic bonds and joined our collective, while others retreated deeper into the false certainty of their roles, terrified by the prospect of individual responsibility. The demigods, those beings who had been shaped by millennia of the two fingers manipulation, reacted with varying degrees of confusion and rage. Some, like Rani, had always suspected the artificial nature of the cosmic order and welcomed the chaos our rebellion had introduced. Others, particularly those whose entire existence was predicated on serving the greater will, found themselves facing an existential crisis that threatened to unmake them entirely. But perhaps the most significant change was what happened to the Erd Tree itself. The great golden structure that had dominated the lands between for ages began to shift and change, its light becoming less steady and predictable. Without the two fingers' constant manipulation to maintain its artificial perfection, the tree began to exhibit properties that were more organic, more alive. Its light sometimes flickered, its branches occasionally swayed without wind, and its influence over the realm became less absolute and more negotiable. The change I noticed most profoundly was in my connection to my original identity. The cold fingers that had first touched my forehead in what felt like a lifetime ago had left their mark, but that mark was no longer a brand of ownership. Instead, it had become a gateway, a connection point that allowed me to access my memories of being Ilara the baker's daughter whenever I chose to remember her. I could recall the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of my mother's embrace, the simple pleasure of watching sunrise paint our village in golden light. But these memories no longer felt like remnants of a lost life. They felt like treasures I had chosen to preserve, pieces of my humanity that I could call upon to ground my cosmic awareness in something real and meaningful. The last coherent communication we received from the dying Two Fingers was a warning disguised as a prophecy. You have broken the chains that held reality together. What comes next will be beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Mortals will create wonders beyond imagination, and they will commit atrocities that will echo through the ages. The age of order is ending, and the age of chaos begins. We hope, for all our differences, that you find the strength to guide them through what is coming. As their ancient consciousness finally dissolved completely, leaving only the hybrid entity that we had become, I found myself standing once again in the chamber where my transformation had begun. But the massive stone fingers were gone, crumbled into dust that sparkled with residual cosmic energy. In their place was something that looked almost like a garden, strange, luminescent plants that seemed to grow from the very stone itself, reaching toward a light that came from no visible source. The other maidens in our collective began to manifest their own physical forms, stepping out of our shared consciousness to exist as individuals while maintaining our connection to the greater whole. Renala appeared as she had been in life but enhanced, her scholarly nature now backed by cosmic understanding. Irina retained her youthful appearance but carried herself with the wisdom of centuries. Each of us was both individual and collective, human and transcendent, bound together by choice rather than compulsion. "What do we do now?" Irina asked, her voice carrying both wonder and uncertainty as she gazed out at the changed world that surrounded us. "We learn," I replied, feeling the weight and responsibility of our new existence settling around me like a familiar cloak. "We grow. We help those who want our help and leave alone those who prefer to find their own way. Most importantly, we remember what it means to be human, even as we become something more." The lands between stretched out before us, vast and full of possibility. The age of cosmic manipulation was ending, and the age of genuine choice was beginning. It would be beautiful and terrible, as the Two Fingers had predicted, but it would be real in a way that their sterile order never could have been. And somewhere in the distance I could smell the faint aroma of baking bread, carried on a wind that spoke of home, of choice, and of futures that remained unwritten.